They say the desert only reveals its secrets to the lonely, and on that evening a lone cowboy was about to learn why. The sun was sliding low over the Arizona desert, turning the sand and red stone into a sea of copper light that stretched for miles in every direction. Ethan Cole rode slowly across the open land. The steady rhythm of his horse's hooves the only sound in a world that had grown quiet long before sundown. Out here, 40 miles from the nearest town, and even farther from anything resembling comfort, a man had plenty of time to think. Ethan had spent the better part of 3 years doing exactly that. He had left towns behind, left arguments behind, left the kind of life that kept a man surrounded by voices and expectations. The desert didn't ask questions. The desert didn't judge. It simply watched. And that was why Ethan trusted it more than most people he had known. His canteen knocked softly against the saddle as he rode, the dry air carrying the scent of warm dust and sagebrush. The horizon shimmered with heat, even as the evening breeze began to move across the open flats. Ethan adjusted the brim of his hat and scanned the distance the way any careful traveler did. In the desert, the smallest change in the landscape could mean water, danger, or nothing at all. But this time it meant something else entirely. At first he thought it was just a trick of the light, the kind that happened when the sun bent low and shadows stretched long across the sand. A shape stood out against the pale earth nearly 200 yards ahead. Still, silent, unmoving. Ethan slowed his horse without thinking. The animal sensed it too, lowering its head slightly, as if unsure whether to step closer or turn aside. The shape didn't move. It didn't wave or call out the way a lost traveler might. It simply stood there, framed by the endless sky and the long shadows of the desert evening. As Ethan rode closer, the figure slowly became clear. It was a young woman standing alone in the open desert. Her dark hair moved gently in the wind, and the long lines of her clothing carried patterns Ethan recognized from stories told around frontier fires. Apache. The realization settled in quietly but firmly. This land was known to belong to one of the Apache bands that moved through the region with the seasons. Most settlers kept their distance. Most travelers turned back long before reaching this part of the desert. Yet here she stood, calm as a stone marker on an old trail. Ethan stopped his horse about 30 yards away. He kept his hands resting loosely on the saddle horn, making sure every movement looked slow and respectful. The desert wind passed between them, lifting small spirals of dust across the ground. The woman studied him with steady dark eyes that seemed to measure not just the man in front of her, but the choices that had carried him this far into the quiet land. Then she spoke, her voice calm and clear in the evening air. "You've come a long way, cowboy." Ethan nodded once, glancing briefly at the open desert behind her. Something about the stillness of the moment felt heavier than the quiet itself. "Looks like I have," he said. The woman tilted her head slightly, as though weighing a thought that had been waiting long before he arrived. "Most men don't ride this far unless they're lost," she said softly. Ethan let a faint smile touch the corner of his mouth. "Or unless they're looking for something." The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of distant rain somewhere beyond the horizon. For a long second neither of them moved. Then the woman looked past Ethan toward the fading light behind him and said words that would echo through the years that followed. "You should know something before you ride another mile," she said. Ethan waited. Her gaze returned to his, steady and unreadable. "You are not alone out here." The wind moved across the desert like a slow breath, carrying grains of sand that whispered against Ethan Cole's boots and the worn leather of his saddle. For a moment he said nothing, letting the woman's words settle into the quiet space between them. "You are not alone out here." In most places that would not have meant much. But in the open desert, miles from towns and fences, it meant everything. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the rocky ridges scattered along the horizon. The land looked empty, the way deserts often did, but he had spent enough years riding lonely trails to understand something most newcomers never learned. Empty land did not always mean empty eyes. "How many?" he asked calmly. The woman did not answer right away. Instead, she studied him the way a careful reader studies the first page of a book, searching for clues about what kind of story might follow. Her gaze moved from his hat to the dust on his coat, then down to the calloused hands resting loosely on the saddle horn. When she finally spoke again, Her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who understood the land far better than any map ever could. "Enough," she said. Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. That was answer enough. Somewhere among the ridges, behind the tall stone outcroppings and the narrow passes carved by centuries of wind, there were watchers. Apache warriors most likely. Silent. Patient. Waiting to see what this lone cowboy intended to do. Ethan turned his horse slightly, so the animal stood at ease rather than facing the woman directly. Small gestures mattered out here. Respect traveled farther than words. "If I had come looking for trouble," Ethan said quietly, "I would not have come alone." The woman considered that. A faint line appeared at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but something close to recognition. "Trouble often travels alone," she replied. The desert wind lifted her dark hair again, revealing the silver beadwork along the collar of her clothing. Ethan noticed the details now. The steady way she held her shoulders. The calm balance in her stance. This was not someone lost in the desert. This was someone who belonged to it. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The sun continued to sink behind the western mesas, painting the sky in long ribbons of amber and purple. The temperature had begun to drop the way it always did after sunset, the desert shifting from harsh daylight into its quieter evening face. Finally, Ethan gestured toward the land stretching behind the woman. "I need to pass through," he said. "There is a settlement about 20 miles north of here. A child there is sick. The doctor sent me to bring back medicine before morning." The woman listened without interrupting. Her expression did not change, but something thoughtful moved behind her eyes. "And you believe the desert will give you a straight road?" she asked. Ethan shook his head slightly. "No, ma'am. I believe it gives every man the road he earns." That answer seemed to interest her. She stepped forward one slow pace, the sand barely making a sound beneath her feet. For the first time Ethan noticed something else. The land behind her was too quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of empty desert, but the kind of stillness that came when many people were holding their breath at the same time. The woman glanced briefly toward the distant rocks, as if confirming something only she could see. Then she looked back at Ethan. "The land you want to cross," she said slowly, "is a sacred trail of my people. Most outsiders turn back when they learn this." Ethan nodded once. "I understand." The woman studied him for another long moment, measuring patience against purpose. Then she said something that neither the desert wind nor the fading sunlight could soften. "If you ride forward without permission," she said, "the desert will not be the only thing watching you." The woman's words lingered in the cooling desert air, steady and certain, like stones placed carefully across a river. "If you ride forward without permission, the desert will not be the only thing watching you." Ethan Cole looked past her again, this time slower, letting his eyes drift across the sandstone ridges and the narrow shadows gathering between them as evening settled over the land. Nothing moved. No riders appeared. No sound carried across the flats except the quiet shifting of wind over dry earth. Yet the silence felt full, the way a canyon feels full even when the sky above it looks empty. Ethan understood the meaning well enough. Somewhere among those rocks, patient eyes were studying him. Men who knew every inch of this land. Men who had waited far longer than he had been riding today. Ethan rested one hand against the saddle horn and spoke with the same calm tone he had carried since the moment he first saw her standing alone in the desert. "Then I suppose I should ask permission." The woman watched him closely, as though she had expected a dozen other answers, but not that one. For a moment her expression remained unreadable. Then she tilted her head slightly, considering the stranger before her. The fading sunlight caught the dark shine of her hair as the desert breeze moved softly across the open ground. "Most men do not ask," she said quietly. "Most men ride until someone stops them." Ethan gave a faint shrug. That sounds like a good way to meet the wrong kind of ending. Something about that answer seemed to settle into the space between them. The woman stepped another pace closer, the sand whispering beneath her feet. Ethan noticed again how balanced her movements were, the easy confidence of someone who had walked this land since childhood. She glanced briefly toward the distant rock formations behind her. Even though Ethan still could not see anyone there, he knew the watchers were listening. After a moment, she turned back to him. "My name is Ayanna," she said. The name carried a quiet strength, like the land itself. Ethan nodded respectfully. "Ethan Cole." Ayanna repeated the name slowly, as if testing how it fit within the desert air. Then she looked toward the horizon, where the last edge of sunlight was slipping behind the mesas. The sky had begun to deepen into long bands of purple and dark gold, the kind of evening that arrived quickly in the open desert. "You said you carry medicine for a child," she said. Ethan nodded. "That is right. And you believe crossing our sacred trail is the fastest way back to your town." "It saves nearly 12 miles, Ethan replied. "Without it, I may not reach the settlement before morning." Ayana considered the distance. 12 miles in desert country could mean the difference between arriving in time and arriving too late. The wind shifted again, brushing lightly across the open ground as the first evening chill crept into the air. For several seconds Ayana remained silent. Then she said something that changed the quiet tension of the moment into something far stranger. "If the desert accepts you," she said slowly, "then you may cross." Ethan raised one eyebrow slightly. "And how does a man know if the desert accepts him?" Ayana turned and gestured toward the narrow canyon trail that cut through the rocky hills a quarter-mile away. The dark opening of the passage looked like a doorway carved into the earth itself. "That path is called the Whispering Pass," she said. "The wind moves through those stones in ways that even our people respect. It is a place where the desert decides who may walk safely through its heart." Ethan followed her gaze toward the canyon. The passage looked narrow and shadowed, the kind of trail that twisted through stone walls shaped by centuries of wind and weather. Ayana looked back at him, her eyes steady and calm. "If you ride through that pass with me," she said, "and the desert remains quiet, then my people will know the land has allowed you to continue." Ethan studied the distant canyon entrance, then returned his gaze to her. "And if the desert does not stay quiet?" Ayana's expression did not change. "Then you will understand why most travelers turn back long before they reach this place." The entrance to Whispering Pass waited in the deepening dusk like a narrow doorway carved into the bones of the earth. Ethan Cole studied the dark trail for a long moment before gently nudging his horse forward. Ayana had already begun walking toward the canyon, her steps steady and quiet, as if she had followed this path more times than she could remember. The distance between them and the canyon mouth was less than a quarter-mile, yet the land felt different with every step they took. The wind moved more slowly here, curling around the stone outcrops and carrying faint echoes through the rising rock walls ahead. Ethan kept his pace easy, careful not to rush his horse or crowd the woman walking beside him. The last line of sunlight slid behind the mesas, leaving the sky washed in soft violet and pale silver. Evening had fully arrived. When they reached the canyon entrance, the temperature dropped almost 10 degrees in an instant, the tall stone walls trapping cool air that smelled faintly of dust and ancient rain. The narrow trail twisted between sandstone cliffs that rose nearly 40 feet above them on both sides. Ethan could hear the faint sound Ayana had mentioned earlier. The wind whispered through cracks in the rock, creating a soft, hollow murmur that drifted through the canyon like distant voices carried across water. Ayana slowed her pace and glanced back toward him. "This is where the desert listens," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once and guided his horse forward beside her. The trail was barely wide enough for the animal, forcing Ethan to keep one hand lightly on the saddle horn while his boots brushed close to the canyon wall. Small stones shifted under the horse's hooves, but the animal moved carefully, trusting the calm hand on the reins. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the slow footsteps, the quiet breathing of the horse, and the strange whispering wind that slipped between the narrow stone passages above them. Ethan noticed something else now. The desert behind them had been wide and open, but here the world felt close and watchful. The canyon bent and curved every few dozen yards, hiding what waited beyond each turn. Yet Ayana never hesitated. She walked with the same quiet confidence, her eyes scanning the trail the way someone reads familiar lines in a book they have known since childhood. After a few minutes she spoke again, without looking back. "Many travelers believe the desert is empty," she said, "but the land remembers every step that crosses it." Ethan listened to the soft rhythm of her voice blending with the whispering wind. "Where I grew up," he replied calmly, "we believe the land watches how a man carries himself." Ayana nodded slightly, as if the idea felt familiar. They rounded another curve in the canyon, and the whispering sound grew stronger for a moment before fading again. A narrow beam of moonlight slipped between the cliffs above, painting a pale ribbon across the trail ahead. Ethan glanced upward. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky above the canyon walls. The night desert had its own language, one that spoke in silence and distance rather than noise. Then something unusual happened. The whispering wind that had followed them through the canyon slowly faded away. The air grew still. No movement stirred the dry brush along the canyon edges. Even the faint sound of shifting sand disappeared. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Ayanna stopped walking. For a long moment, she stood completely still, listening to the quiet. Then she turned slowly toward Ethan, the moonlight touching the calm lines of her face. "The desert has become quiet," she said softly. Ethan glanced around the narrow passage. The silence felt deeper than before, almost respectful. Ayanna studied the empty trail ahead, then looked back toward the canyon entrance far behind them where darkness had already settled over the open desert. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of quiet surprise. "That has not happened in a long time," she said. For a moment neither of them moved. The silence inside Whispering Pass felt deeper than anything Ethan Cole had heard since entering the canyon, as though the desert itself had paused to listen. His horse shifted slightly beneath him but remained calm, its ears forward, sensing the strange stillness that had settled over the narrow stone corridor. Ethan looked toward Ayanna, noticing the thoughtful expression that had appeared in her eyes. She was studying the quiet trail ahead as if trying to understand a message written in a language older than words. Finally, Ethan spoke in a low voice that barely disturbed the air. "Is that a good sign?" Ayanna did not answer immediately. She took a slow breath and glanced up toward the thin slice of sky visible between the towering canyon walls. The first stars had grown brighter now, scattered across the darkening desert sky like distant lanterns. When she looked back at him, her expression carried both curiosity and respect. "The wind always speaks here," she said softly. "It carries voices through the stone. My people say those voices belong to the spirits of the desert. When the wind falls silent, it means the land is listening closely." Ethan rested one hand against the saddle horn and nodded slightly. "And tonight it decided to listen." Ayanna studied him for another moment. Then her gaze drifted towards something at his chest that had caught the pale moonlight. Ethan noticed the shift in her attention and followed her eyes downward. Hanging from a simple leather cord around his neck was a small turquoise pendant set in worn silver. The stone had been polished smooth by time and travel, and the silver wire around it carried a pattern that looked both delicate and strong. Ayanna stepped a little closer, her eyes narrowing slightly as she examined the pendant more carefully. The quiet canyon air seemed to grow even stiller as she reached out and gently touched the edge of the turquoise stone with one finger. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "Where did you get this?" Ethan looked down at the pendant, then back at her. For a moment, the memory behind that small piece of turquoise returned as clearly as if the desert had uncovered it from the sand of his past. "My mother gave it to me," he said. Ayanna's eyes lifted toward his again. "Your mother was Apache?" she asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. "No, ma'am. She was from Kansas." A faint crease appeared between Ayanna's brows as she studied the pendant again. "Then how did she come to carry this?" Ethan leaned slightly forward in the saddle, letting the moonlight fall across the turquoise stone. "She once told me a story about a winter when she was traveling west with a wagon train. She became sick somewhere near these lands. Fever so bad the others thought she might not make it through the night." The canyon walls carried his voice gently through the still air. "But someone found her before morning," Ethan continued. "An Apache healer. My mother said the woman stayed with her for 2 days until the fever broke. Before the healer left, she gave my mother this pendant." Ayanna remained silent as she listened, her eyes fixed on the turquoise stone. After a moment she spoke again, her voice softer than before. "Did your mother tell you the healer's name?" Ethan nodded slowly. "She did." The quiet canyon seemed to lean closer around them as he spoke the name aloud. "Her name was Nita." Ayanna inhaled softly, the sound barely louder than the whispering wind had been earlier. For several seconds she said nothing at all. Then she looked up at Ethan with an expression that held both surprise and recognition. "Nita was my grandmother," she said. The words hung in the quiet canyon air like the final note of a song that refused to fade. "Nita was my grandmother." Ethan Cole felt the meaning settle slowly into place. the way desert dust settles after a long wind. For a moment he said nothing. The small turquoise pendant resting against his chest suddenly seemed heavier than it had a minute earlier. Ayana's eyes remained fixed on the stone, her expression caught somewhere between memory and disbelief. The silence of whispering pass continued to surround them, deeper now, as though the canyon itself understood the weight of what had just been spoken. Ethan finally cleared his throat softly. "My mother never forgot her," he said. "She used to tell that story every winter when the nights got cold." Said the woman who helped her had eyes that looked like they understood the desert better than anyone she had ever met. Ayana lowered her hand slowly from the pendant. Her gaze drifted toward the canyon wall beside them, where moonlight traced pale lines across the sandstone. "My grandmother was a healer," she said quietly. "She believed the land gave life to all people who respected it, no matter where they came from." The wind had not returned. The canyon remained still, almost patient. Ethan studied her for a moment before speaking again. "My mother kept the pendant her whole life," he said. "Before she passed, she gave it to me and told me one thing. If I ever crossed Apache land, I should wear it openly. She said it might remind someone that kindness travels farther than fear." Ayana looked back at him, the faint reflection of moonlight shining in her dark eyes. "My grandmother used to say something very similar," she replied. "She believed the desert keeps track of every act of kindness, even the small ones." Ethan gave a quiet nod. The horse beneath him shifted gently but remained calm, the animal sensing the peaceful tone between the two riders. For a few seconds they both listened to the quiet canyon, the stillness stretching between them like a silent witness. Then the quiet changed. It was subtle at first. A faint movement of air brushed along the canyon walls, carrying the distant sound of shifting sand. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Ayana did too. She turned her head slowly toward the far end of the canyon trail where darkness had gathered beyond the moonlit stones. Shapes began to appear there, quiet and steady against the pale ground. Riders. Several of them. Their silhouettes emerged gradually from the shadows, horses stepping carefully along the narrow trail. None of them spoke. None of them hurried. They simply rode forward until the moonlight revealed them clearly. Ethan counted nearly 20 men spread along the canyon in trance behind them. Each rider sat straight in the saddle, their presence calm but unmistakable. Apache warriors. Ayana watched them approach without fear, though her expression grew thoughtful again. She glanced briefly toward Ethan, then back toward the approaching riders. The lead warrior slowed his horse about 30 yards away. He did not raise his voice or gesture. He simply waited, his gaze moving from Ayana to the cowboy sitting quietly beside her. The canyon remained silent except for the soft breathing of horses and the faint rustle of leather. Ethan felt every pair of eyes studying him. Yet no one reached for a weapon. No one spoke a harsh word. They were waiting for something only Ayana could decide. She took one slow step forward, the moonlight falling across her shoulders as she faced the line of riders. Her voice carried through the still canyon, calm and certain. "The desert has accepted his passage," she said. The canyon held its breath as Ayana's words settled over the line of riders. "The desert has accepted his passage." The statement drifted through the still air like a calm ripple across water. None of the warriors spoke immediately. Their horses stood quietly beneath them, heads low, reins loose in practiced hands. Moonlight brushed across the edges of their silhouettes, catching the silver beads on leather and the soft feathers tied to a few of the bridles. Ethan Cole remained still in his saddle, his posture relaxed but respectful. He knew better than to interrupt a moment like this. In places like the desert, decisions were rarely rushed. The lead rider studied Ayana for several seconds, his expression thoughtful beneath the shadow of his hat. Then his gaze shifted toward Ethan. The man's eyes paused briefly on the turquoise pendant resting against Ethan's chest. Even in the dim light, the stone caught a pale glow, its surface reflecting the quiet moon above the canyon walls. The warrior seemed to recognize something in that small piece of silver and turquoise. He spoke at last, his voice low but steady. "You say the desert accepted him." Ayana nodded once. "The wind fell silent inside Whispering Pass," she replied calmly. The stones did not speak against his steps. The riders exchanged quiet glances with one another. To outsiders it might have looked like nothing more than a moment of silence, but Ethan could feel the weight of it. These men were listening not just to her words, but to the meaning behind them. The lead warrior turned his horse slightly, letting the moonlight reveal more of his face. Age had placed faint lines around his eyes, the kind earned through years spent reading the desert sky and the long trails that crossed it. When he spoke again, his tone carried both caution and respect. Few strangers pass through this canyon without the wind raising its voice, he said. Ayana gestured lightly toward Ethan. He carries the blessing of Nita's kindness. The name settled over the group like an old memory. Several of the warriors straightened slightly in their saddles. Even the horses seemed to shift, as if sensing the change in the air. The lead rider looked again at the pendant, then back to Ethan. Nita was respected among our people, he said quietly. Ethan inclined his head. My mother respected her too. The simple answer seemed to satisfy something unspoken among the riders. For a moment the canyon remained silent again. Then Ayana stepped closer to Ethan's horse and turned to face the warriors fully. The moonlight traced the calm confidence in her posture as she spoke once more. He carries medicine for a sick child beyond our lands, she said. His path does not threaten our people. The lead warrior studied her carefully. There was a subtle shift in the way the other riders held themselves now. They were not questioning her authority. They were measuring it. Finally, the older rider gave a small nod. Then the desert has chosen to guide him, he said. He turned his horse slightly aside, creating a narrow opening along the canyon trail behind them. One by one the other riders did the same, their horses stepping back just enough to leave a clear path forward through the moonlit pass. The movement was quiet, deliberate, and respectful. Ethan watched the trail open before him, understanding the gesture without a single word needing explanation. Ayana glanced back at him and gave a small nod toward the path. Your road continues, she said softly. The canyon trail opened before Ethan Cole like a quiet promise written in moonlight. The line of riders remained still along the stone walls, their horses calm and patient as the narrow path cleared between them. Ethan studied the opening for a moment, understanding the meaning behind the gesture. In the desert, a path given was more than permission. It was trust. He tipped the brim of his hat slightly toward the warriors before guiding his horse forward at a slow walk. The animal stepped carefully along the narrow ground, its hooves making soft sounds against the packed earth as they passed between the silent riders. No one spoke. No one moved to block the trail. The only sound was the gentle rustle of leather and the quiet breathing of horses beneath the pale desert moon. As Ethan rode past the lead warrior, the older man gave a small nod of acknowledgement. It was not a grand gesture, but in a land where respect was measured in quiet moments, it carried more meaning than many long speeches. Ethan returned the nod and continued along the trail. Ayana walked beside him again once they passed the riders, her steps steady as the canyon began to widen gradually ahead. The whispering wind had not returned, but the stillness no longer felt uncertain. Instead, it carried a quiet sense of acceptance, as though the desert had decided the direction of this night's journey. They walked for several more minutes before the canyon walls slowly lowered and the trail opened toward the northern flats. The moon now hung high above the desert, casting silver light across the open land that stretched for miles ahead. Ethan could see the distant outline of cottonwood trees near a small creek nearly 12 miles away. Beyond that, another 8 miles north, the faint lantern lights of the settlement would be waiting. Ayana stopped where the canyon ended and the open desert began. She looked across the moonlit land with the calm gaze of someone who understood every shadow and ridge between here and the horizon. Ethan gently guided his horse to a halt beside her. For a moment, they both looked north toward the distant trees. From here the land is clear, she said quietly. Your town is 18 miles from this place. If you keep that line of cottonwoods to your left, you will reach the settlement before the moon sets. Ethan followed her gesture, nodding slowly as he measured the distance in his mind. Then the child may still receive the medicine in time, he said. Ayana gave a faint nod. For a few seconds neither of them spoke again. The desert wind had begun to move softly across the flats once more, carrying the cool scent of night air through the open land. Ethan reached into the saddlebag tied behind his seat and carefully pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside rested the medicine bottle wrapped securely in cloth. He checked it briefly before securing the pouch again. Ayana watched him quietly, then looked back toward the canyon behind them where the riders still waited in silent formation. "The desert rarely brings strangers together without reason," she said softly. Ethan glanced toward the turquoise pendant resting against his chest. "Sometimes the reason began long before we ever arrive," he replied. Ayana considered that for a moment before a small smile touched the corner of her mouth. Then she stepped back slightly from the trail and gestured toward the open desert ahead. "Ride quickly, Ethan Cole," she said. "The night is on your side." Ethan gave her one final nod of gratitude before gently guiding his horse forward into the moonlit desert, the quiet path north stretching wide and clear beneath the silver sky. The desert stretched wide beneath the quiet glow of the moon as Ethan Cole rode north across the open flats. The cool night wind brushed against his coat while his horse moved at a steady pace, its hooves carrying him mile after mile across the silver sand. The land felt different now. The long shadows no longer carried the same watchful tension they had earlier that evening. Instead, the desert seemed calm, almost approving, as if it had already decided the path of the night's story. Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the distant line of cottonwood trees Ayana had shown him. They stood like dark shapes against the horizon, their branches faintly stirring in the night air beside the narrow creek that wound quietly through the desert. By the time he reached them, the moon had climbed higher in the sky and the first hint of dawn had begun to touch the eastern horizon nearly 18 miles away. The ride had been long but steady. Ethan slowed his horse briefly at the creek, letting the animal drink for a moment while he checked the leather pouch in his saddlebag. The medicine bottle remained safe inside the cloth wrapping. He secured the pouch again and continued north. Soon the faint lantern lights of the small settlement appeared ahead, glowing warmly in the darkness like small stars resting on the ground. A few minutes later, Ethan rode into the quiet street where wooden buildings stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the pale morning sky. A lantern still burned outside the doctor's office. Ethan dismounted quickly and stepped onto the wooden porch just as the door opened and the town doctor appeared in the doorway, surprised to see him arriving before sunrise. Ethan handed over the small medicine bottle without a word. The doctor nodded with relief and hurried back inside to prepare the remedy for the sick child waiting across town. Ethan remained on the porch for a moment, watching the eastern sky grow brighter with the first colors of morning. The long night ride had finally ended. By the time the sun rose above the desert hills, word had quietly spread that the child's fever had begun to ease. People spoke with gratitude about the cowboy who had crossed the desert through the night to bring the medicine back in time. Yet Ethan said little about the road he had taken. Later that morning, once the town had settled into its usual rhythm, he saddled his horse again and rode back toward the open desert. When he reached the place where Whispering Pass opened toward the flats, the land looked exactly as it always had. The wind moved gently across the sand. The canyon stood silent beneath the bright desert sky. There were no riders waiting there now. No quiet line of warriors watching from the rocks. Only the empty trail stretching into the Redstone Hills. Ethan dismounted and walked a few steps toward the canyon entrance. For a moment, he studied the narrow path where the wind once whispered between the stones. Then he reached up and touched the turquoise pendant resting against his chest. The stone felt warm beneath his fingers. Ethan gave a small nod toward the silent canyon before mounting his horse again. As he rode away across the open desert, the wind slowly returned to Whispering Pass, carrying its soft voices through the stone just as it had for countless seasons before. And in the years that followed, travelers crossing those lonely trails sometimes spoke of a quiet story shared around campfires. A story about a lone cowboy who once rode through sacred desert land under the watchful eyes of Apache warriors. A story about a healer's kindness that crossed generations. And about a night when the desert itself chose to guide a stranger safely home.